Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that might just be the cure for any restless thoughts lingering in your mind, the Benin Bronzes. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bronzes, polishing, ancient history, it sounds like the perfect recipe for a snooze, doesn't it? You might even wonder if you'll make it past the first few minutes without your eyelids staging a full-on rebellion. But trust me, there's a quiet, almost hypnotic quality to understanding the sheer patience and dedication that went into creating these masterpieces. Imagine yourself, for a moment, not here in your cozy bed, but transported back to a bustling West African city. The air thick with the scent of wood smoke and metal, the rhythmic clang of hammers echoing softly in the distance. You can almost feel the smooth, cool surface of a newly cast bronze plaque, still warm from the sun, waiting for its ultimate transformation. It's a journey through time, a meditation on craftsmanship, and, if we're being honest, a rather effective way to gently guide you towards the land of Nod. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fun to see how far our sleepy little community stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on ancient ground, though not yet in Benin. We're casting our minds back, way back, to the very dawn of metallurgy. Before the gleaming bronzes, before intricate designs, before even the idea of combining metals, there was a spark of curiosity. Imagine early humans, perhaps foraging for berries, or chipping away at flint for tools, stumbling upon a strange, heavy rock. It's unlike anything they've encountered. It doesn't shatter like stone, it bends, it dents. Historians still argue whether the first discovery of metal was intentional prospecting or a happy accident. Perhaps a piece of copper left too close to a roaring campfire, melting and reforming into a new, fascinating shape. This wasn't sophisticated science, of course. It was observation, trial, and error on a grand millennia-spanning scale. You can almost hear the grunts of surprise, the murmurs of wonder, as our distant ancestors poked and prodded these enigmatic stones. This initial interaction wasn't about creating art, it was about utility. Could this malleable material make better arrowheads, stronger digging sticks? The thought of adorning a king's palace was centuries, even millennia, away. This was the primordial soup of technological innovation, slow simmering over countless generations. Think of it like this. If making a bronze statue is building a skyscraper, then discovering metal was finding the very first wonky brick. And for a long time, that one brick was just a brick. They had no idea what wonders could be built with it or how much elbow grease it would take to make it shine. You're still there, aren't you? Good. Our journey through the sleepy depths of history continues, gently. So, our ancestors had found these strange bendy rocks. But what were they? For the longest time, the most accessible and pliable of these rocks was copper. Imagine a world without metal tools, where everything from cutting meat to clearing land relied on stone, bone, or wood. Then, someone discovers that this peculiar reddish-brown stone, when hammered, doesn't chip or break. It flattens, it stretches, it reshapes. It's a bit like discovering that if you hit a marshmallow hard enough, it turns into a pancake. Utterly revolutionary, if less delicious. This wasn't about melting yet. It was about cold hammering, a technique so ancient it makes your average Stone Age tool look like high-tech gadgetry. You can almost hear the rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk as early metallurgists, perhaps with callous hands and remarkably strong forearms, patiently beat pieces of native copper into desired shapes. This discovery wasn't a sudden flash of genius across the globe. but rather an independent emergence in several places. Think of it like different groups of people all figuring out that if you rub two sticks together really fast, you get fire. Some of the earliest evidence of copper working, dating back as far as 9000 BCE, comes from places like what is now modern-day Turkey and Iraq. You can picture these early artisans, squinting in the flickering light of a fire, trying to coax a sharp edge onto a copper blade. It wasn't easy. Copper, even when hammered, is relatively soft. It dulls quickly, bends under pressure, and isn't ideal for heavy-duty tasks. It's like trying to cut down a tree with a butter knife. Technically possible, but you'd be there all day and the knife wouldn't be looking so hot afterwards. But it was a start, a crucial step on the long, meandering path to the gleaming Benin Bronzes we'll eventually encounter. This early phase of copper use, often referred to as the Chalcolithic period or the Copper Age, marked a significant departure from purely stone-based technologies. It opened up new possibilities for tools, for ornaments, and eventually for weapons. Historians still argue whether the discovery of annealing heating copper to make it less brittle and easier to work was a simultaneous innovation with cold hammering or a later accidental revelation. It's a bit like wondering if they figured out how to toast the marshmallow before they realized they could smash it flat. The progression of knowledge, particularly in those early pre-literate societies, is often a fuzzy, guess-laden affair, isn't it? It's a testament to human ingenuity, born out of necessity and a good dose of persistent curiosity. Even if the results initially were, well, a little underwhelming by today's standards. Imagine trying to impress your neighbors with a slightly dented copper bracelet that looks suspiciously like a flattened rock. You probably wouldn't win any fashion awards, but it was a beginning. A very, very slow beginning. Still with me? Excellent. We've established that copper was the trailblazer, the first metal to truly capture human attention. But as we gently drift through the annals of time, you start to realize copper had its limitations. It was soft, remember? Think of it like trying to build a really sturdy bridge out of licorice. It looks promising, but it won't hold much weight. Early metalworkers, through continued experimentation, likely noticed this inherent weakness. Their copper tools would bend, their ornaments would easily deform. This inherent flop factor of pure copper meant they were constantly looking for something better, something harder, something that held its shape with more resilience. Now, this is where the plot thickens, or rather, where the metal hardens. The next big leap wasn't about finding a new pure metal, but about understanding that combining metals could create something entirely new and superior. This is the magical moment when bronze enters the scene. Bronze, as you might dimly recall from history lessons that probably felt as long as a geological epoch, isn't a naturally occurring element, is an alloy, primarily of copper and, here's the tricky bit, tin. And finding tin reliably was a whole different ballgame. It wasn't as widespread as copper. Imagine trying to bake a cake, but one crucial ingredient is only found on top of a very specific, hard-to-reach mountain. That was tin. The discovery of how to combine copper with tin, and more importantly, the right proportions of tin, was a monumental achievement. It probably wasn't some ancient genius exclaiming, "Eureka! Let's try 10% tin." More likely, it was a long, slow process of accidental contaminations in furnaces, observing differences in the resulting metal, and then trying to replicate those happy accidents. Historians still argue whether the initial discovery of bronze was truly accidental, with tin ore impurities finding their way into copper smelting, or if it was the result of deliberate experimentation by early metallurgists seeking to improve their copper. You can almost picture them, scratching their heads, peering into their primitive furnaces, wondering why this batch of metal was so much tougher than the last. Perhaps, one might have mused, it was that funny looking rock I threw in there for good measure. The result? However it happened was transformative. Bronze was harder than copper, held a sharper edge, and was more durable. It could be cast into more intricate shapes once melted, and it retained its form better after cooling. This meant better tools for farming, more effective weapons for hunting or defense, and crucially for our story, the ability to create more complex and lasting artistic expressions. Think of it, from licorice to something more like hardened toffee. A significant upgrade, wouldn't you agree? This technological jump paved the way for entirely new societies, new economies based on metal production, and eventually the highly sophisticated craftsmanship that would lead to the magnificent Benin Bronzes. But first, they had to figure out where on earth all that tin was hiding. That, my friend, was a puzzle that spanned continents. You're still drifting, gently, through the mist of prehistory, and we're zeroing in on that elusive ingredient, tin. Imagine the ancient world as a giant scavenger hunt, and tin was the rarest, most prized item on the list. It wasn't found in large, easily accessible veins like some copper ores. Often it appeared in alluvial deposits, mixed in riverbeds, or as cassiterite, a heavy, dark mineral that looks suspiciously like just another rock to the untrained eye. So the search for tin was a painstaking, often frustrating endeavor, like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a vast beach. This scarcity meant that wherever tin was found, it instantly became a strategic commodity. Think of it like modern day rare earth minerals, only instead of powering your smartphone, it was empowering the very foundations of early civilization. The need for tin sparked some of the earliest long distance trade routes. You can almost picture hardy prospectors and traders, loaded down with their precious cargo, traversing vast landscapes, navigating unfamiliar territories, all in pursuit of this vital component for stronger tools and weapons. Historians still argue whether the knowledge of combining copper and tin spread rapidly through cultural exchange, with people adopting the technology as they learned about it, or if it was repeatedly discovered independently in different regions due to the sheer utility of the resulting alloy. It's a bit like wondering if everyone figured out how to use a lever on their own, or if one clever person showed everyone else. One of the most famous ancient sources of tin, incredibly important for the development of European Bronze Age cultures, was in Cornwall, in what is now southwest England. Imagine the arduous journey for tin to reach, say, the Mycenaean civilization in ancient Greece. That's a seriously long supply chain for an age without proper roads, let alone cargo planes. But this global search for tin also led to incredible ingenuity in mining and refining. Early miners weren't using dynamite or heavy machinery, of course. They were chipping away at rock faces with stone tools, digging rudimentary shafts, and then painstakingly washing and separating the heavier tin ore from lighter materials. It was backbreaking work, driven by the knowledge that this seemingly ordinary rock could transform soft copper into something truly revolutionary. Without reliable access to tin, the Bronze Age simply wouldn't have happened. We'd still be in a souped-up Copper Age, perhaps with slightly better hammering techniques. So, as you visualize these ancient people, painstakingly extracting, transporting, and then carefully combining these two distinct metals, you begin to appreciate the sheer human effort behind even the most fundamental technological shifts. It wasn't just about discovering the materials. It was about mastering their properties, understanding their subtle interactions, and developing the complex logistics to bring them together. It's a lesson in patience, perseverance, and the timeless human drive to make things just a little bit better, a little bit stronger, and yes, eventually, a little bit shinier. You're still suspended in that cozy, almost asleep state, aren't you? Good. Now that we've seen how challenging it was to even get the ingredients for bronze, let's marvel at how quickly, relatively speaking, this game-changing technology spread across the globe. We call it the Bronze Age, but it wasn't a single, synchronized event. Think of it like a ripple effect. Once someone figured out how to make a really good biscuit, word, or at least the biscuit itself, slowly but surely made its way to other kitchens. The timeline varies wildly depending on where you look. In the Near East, the Bronze Age kicked off around 3300 BCE, bringing with it powerful empires and monumental architecture. You can almost feel the desert wind carrying the clanking sounds of early workshops across ancient Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, in regions like Europe, the Bronze Age started a bit later, around 3200 BCE in some areas, and much later in others. And in parts of Africa, distinct, independent metalworking traditions blossomed even as other parts of the world were already deep into their own Bronze Ages. It's not like there was an ancient Bronze Age global newsletter everyone subscribed to. The spread was complex, a mix of direct trade, migration of peoples, and the simple diffusion of ideas. Imagine a group of traveling merchants arriving in a new village, showcasing their incredibly sharp bronze tools, and the local inhabitants' eyes widening in astonishment. How did they make that? You can almost hear them whisper. This diffusion wasn't just about the technology itself, it was about the profound societal changes it brought. Suddenly, agriculture became more efficient with bronze plows and sickles. Warfare changed irrevocably with stronger weapons and armor. Social hierarchy shifted as those who controlled access to metals and the knowledge of metallurgy gained immense power and prestige. This era saw the rise of sophisticated trade networks as goods, ideas, and of course, those vital metal ores crisscrossed continents. Historians still argue whether the invention of bronze technology led directly to the rise of complex urban societies, or if it was the other way around, with developing societies creating the demand and infrastructure necessary for such technological leaps. It's a bit like debating whether the egg came before the extremely well-armed chicken. The global spread of bronze also means that when we finally arrive at the magnificent Benin Bronzes, you'll understand that they weren't created in a vacuum. They emerged from a long, rich history of human innovation in metallurgy, a story stretching back thousands of years and spanning countless cultures. Each civilization adapted the technology to its own needs, its own artistic expressions, and its own unique resources. And that, my friend, is where our journey takes a distinct turn, focusing on the fascinating and often overlooked metalworking traditions of West Africa, a region that developed its own remarkable metallurgical prowess with a distinctive flair. So, let's leave the dusty plains of Mesopotamia and the misty hills of Cornwall behind for a moment and turn our attention to the vibrant, innovative lands of West Africa. You're still nestled in that calm space, floating gently forward in time. We've traversed vast stretches of early metallurgical history, but now our focus narrows to a specific, vibrant part of the world, West Africa. It's crucial to understand that while the Bronze Age was indeed sweeping through parts of Europe and Asia, West Africa was developing its own robust and, importantly, independent traditions in metalworking. This wasn't a case of simply adopting technologies from afar, it was a testament to indigenous innovation and mastery. Imagine different gardens, all growing magnificent flowers, but each with its own unique soil and watering methods. West Africa cultivated its own metallurgical bloom. Long before the magnificent Benin Bronzes were conceived, remarkable metalworking skills were flourishing across regions like what is now Nigeria, Ghana, and Mali. For instance, evidence suggests that iron smelting, a more complex process than bronze casting, was independently developed in parts of West Africa as early as the first millennium BCE. This is a quirky tidbit often overlooked in mainstream historical narratives. While much of the world was still firmly in its Bronze Age, some West African societies were already forging ahead into the Iron Age. It's like arriving at a party to find some guests are still discussing dial-up internet, while others are already streaming 8K video. This independent development of ironworking is particularly fascinating because it suggests a deep, intuitive understanding of metallurgy. To work iron requires higher temperatures and different techniques than bronze. This advanced knowledge laid a strong foundation for sophisticated bronze and brass casting that will follow. You can almost feel the intense heat radiating from the furnaces, the rhythmic pounding of smiths shaping glowing metal, the air thick with the scent of charcoal and iron. This wasn't just about making tools. It was about creating objects of power, prestige, and profound spiritual significance. Societies like the Nok culture, renowned for their terracotta sculptures dating back to 500 BCE, also show evidence of early iron use, pointing to a rich, complex artistic and technological landscape. Historians still argue whether the presence of robust ironworking traditions influenced the development of advanced bronze casting techniques, providing a deeper understanding of material properties and heat control, or if the two evolved largely in parallel. Regardless, it's clear that West African artisans were not merely imitators, they were innovators, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with metal, developing unique processes that would culminate in the unparalleled artistry of the Benin Kingdom. This rich, deep foundation in local metalworking traditions is absolutely essential to understanding the sheer quality and complexity of the bronzes we're here to gently appreciate. You're still floating comfortably, letting the gentle current of history carry you. Now, we're going to dive into a specific, fascinating example of West African metalworking genius that predates the Benin Bronzes by centuries, the Igbo UKWU culture. Imagine, if you will, being transported to southeastern Nigeria, sometime between the 9th and 10th centuries CE. There, a sophisticated society was creating some of the most intricate and technically astounding bronze and copper objects the world had ever seen. Their specialty? The lost wax casting method, perfected to an almost unbelievable degree. This wasn't just melting metal and pouring it into a simple mold. Oh no. This was a multi-step, incredibly precise process that demanded immense skill and patience. Picture this. You start by sculpting your desired object, perhaps an elaborate pot or a finely detailed human figure, entirely out of beeswax. Every tiny detail, every delicate filigree must be painstakingly rendered in the wax. This wax model is, in essence, the soul of the future metal object. Then, this wax masterpiece is carefully coated with layers of clay, from a fine inner layer that captures every detail, to a coarser outer layer that provides strength. It's like wrapping a delicate butterfly in increasingly sturdy blankets. Once the clay is dry, the whole assembly is heated in a furnace. And here's the lost part of lost wax. As the mold heats up, the wax melts and drains out, leaving a hollow cavity that is an exact negative of the original wax sculpture. It's a moment of delicate precision, isn't it? If the wax doesn't drain completely, or if the clay mold cracks, the whole effort is for naught. You can almost smell the faint, sweet scent of melting beeswax mingling with the earthy smell of fired clay. Then, molten metal, usually bronze or brass, is poured into this now empty cavity. Once the metal cools and solidifies, the clay mold is carefully broken away, revealing the finished metal object. The sheer complexity of some of the Igbo UKWU pieces is mind-boggling. They created objects with incredibly thin walls, intricate openwork designs, and multiple moving parts, all cast as a single piece. Historians still argue whether the Igbo UKWU metallurgists developed their lost wax technique completely independently, or if there were some very early indirect influences from other cultures. It's a bit like wondering if they invented sliced bread or just really perfected the art of cutting a loaf. Regardless, their mastery was undeniable. This quirky tidbit reveals just how deeply embedded and advanced metalworking traditions were in West Africa long before the European powers arrived. The legacy of Igbo, Ukwu's artistic and technical brilliance would quietly, but profoundly, influence later metalworking centers, including the one we're about to approach, the formidable Kingdom of Benin. You're still comfortably drifting, absorbing the gentle hum of history, as we shift our focus from the broad strokes of early metallurgy to a specific powerful entity, the Benin Kingdom. Imagine a vibrant, highly organized society flourishing in West Africa, specifically in what is now modern-day Nigeria, from around the 13th century CE onwards. This was not some small village. This was a sophisticated, centralized state ruled by a powerful king known as the Oba. You can almost feel the organized rhythm of life in Benin City, the capital, a sprawling metropolis with wide streets and impressive earthen fortifications that would have rivaled many European cities of the time. The origins of the Benin Kingdom are steeped in oral tradition and a rich tapestry of myths and legends passed down through generations. According to these traditions, the first Oba of Benin was Oranmiyan, a prince from the ancient Yoruba city of Ile-Ife. This connection to Ile-Ife is a mainstream historical fact that underscores the deep cultural and artistic links between these powerful West African polities. Ile-Ife itself was another center of astounding bronze and terracotta artistry, demonstrating a shared heritage of metallurgical excellence. You can imagine the tales of Ormian's journey, weaving through the dense forests, establishing a new dynasty, and laying the groundwork for a kingdom that would endure for centuries. The Obas of Benin were not just rulers. They were seen as divine, semi-sacred figures, holding immense spiritual and political power. Their authority was absolute, and their court was a hub of ritual, administration, and artistic patronage. This concentration of power was crucial for the flourishing of the art, especially the demanding and resource-intensive craft of bronze casting. Think of it like a really focused ancient art foundation, except the patron was also the absolute monarch. This unified leadership allowed for consistent demand, the organization of skilled labor, and the acquisition of the necessary raw materials. A quirky tidbit often overlooked is the meticulous administrative structure of the Benin Kingdom. Beyond the Oba, there were various councils of chiefs, palace societies, and a highly organized system for governing the kingdom and its provinces. This bureaucratic efficiency, far from being boring, was actually a key factor in supporting the arts. It ensured the smooth flow of resources, the training of apprentices, and the maintenance of artistic guilds, allowing the bronze casters to focus on their highly specialized craft. Historians still argue whether the centralized power of the Oba was the primary catalyst for Benin's artistic flourishing, or if the inherent skill and ingenuity of the Edo people would have led to similar artistic achievements regardless of the political structure. It's a bit like wondering if a magnificent garden thrives purely because of the gardener, or if the seeds were just exceptionally good to begin with. But one thing is clear. The rise of the Benin Kingdom created the perfect environment for the bronzes to truly shine. You're still comfortably settled, gently drawn into the narrative. Having understood the powerful foundation of the Benin Kingdom, let's now turn our attention to how that power directly fueled an unprecedented artistic boom, the Oba's artistic patronage. Imagine the Oba, the divine ruler, not just as a political figure, but as the ultimate art collector and commissioner. His demand for objects that reflected his power, status, and connection to the divine was the very engine driving the creation of the Benin Bronzes. This wasn't art for art's sake. It was art for the sake of solidifying a kingdom. The royal court was the absolute epicenter of artistic production. The Oba commissioned countless plaques, commemorative heads, statues, and other regalia, all made from the precious bronze. These weren't just pretty decorations. Each piece served a specific function within the palace and kingdom. The commemorative heads, for example, honored deceased obas, serving as physical representations of the royal lineage and continuity. The plaques, which once adorned the palace walls, functioned almost like a historical record, depicting important events, rituals, and the hierarchy of the court. You can almost see the dazzling array of objects, gleaming softly in the dim light of the palace, each telling a story of power and tradition. This patronage wasn't just about giving orders, it involved significant investment. Acquiring the raw materials copper and tin was a costly and complex undertaking, requiring extensive trade networks, as we briefly touched upon. The Oba's control over these resources and his ability to finance their acquisition meant that the bronze casters, or Igunaramwan as they were known, had access to everything they needed. It's like a modern day patron building an entire state of the art studio and supplying all the rare, expensive paints and canvases the artist could ever want. A quirky tidbit that often goes unmentioned is the strong spiritual dimension to this patronage. The bronzes were not merely aesthetic objects, they were imbued with spiritual significance, acting as conduits between the living and the ancestral world, particularly the spirits of past obas. The act of commissioning and creating these objects was itself a ritual, ensuring the continued prosperity and protection of the kingdom. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for the sheer volume of bronze production was political propaganda to all visitors or a deeply held spiritual conviction regarding the object's ritual power. It's a bit like wondering if a grand public monument is built mostly to impress or mostly to honor. Regardless, the result was an outpouring of artistry that stands as one of the greatest achievements in human civilization, thanks in no small part to the singular vision and immense resources of the Oba. You're still drifting, gently, through the historical currents, and now we're gliding right into the beating heart of Benin's artistic prowess, the guilds of craftsmen. Imagine, not just individual artists toiling away, but a highly organized, specialized system of workshops, each dedicated to a particular craft. The brass casters, known as the Iguneronwan, were arguably the most prestigious of these guilds. Their workshops were concentrated in a specific quarter of Benin City, known as Igun Street, which even today remains a center for brass casting. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic clanging from hammers, the murmur of voices, and the intense focus of highly skilled artisans. This wasn't some casual hobby. It was a hereditary profession. Knowledge, techniques, and secrets of the trade were meticulously passed down from father to son, generation after generation. Apprentices would start young, learning every single step of the arduous lost wax process, from preparing the wax to polishing the finished piece. Think of it like a medieval European guild, but perhaps even more tightly knit and specialized. This rigorous training ensured an unparalleled consistency in quality and a continuous refinement of their already sophisticated techniques. It also meant that the skills were carefully guarded, enhancing the mystique and power of the casters. The guilds weren't just about training, they were about social order and quality control. They operated under the direct patronage and supervision of the Oba, which meant their work was not only highly valued, but also held to incredibly high standards. Any deviation from the established artistic conventions or a lapse in quality would have been a serious matter. This strict oversight ensured that the bronzes produced were not just beautiful, but also accurately conveyed the messages and symbolism the Oba wished to project. It's a bit like an ancient royal decree for absolute artistic perfection, with very little room for creative whims, unless sanctioned. A quirky tidbit is that beyond the Igunoranwan, Benin City also boasted guilds of wood carvers, ivory carvers, weavers, and blacksmiths, each contributing to the rich artistic tapestry of the kingdom. This specialization allowed each group to achieve incredible mastery in their respective fields. Historians still argue whether the extreme centralization of artistic production under the Oba limited creative expression, or if it allowed for a deeper, more refined exploration of established artistic themes due to consistent demand and resource allocation. It's like wondering if having a strict brief stifles an artist or helps them focus their genius. But what is undeniable is that this guild system was the well-oiled machine that translated the Oba's vision into the tangible, breathtaking reality of the Benin Bronzes, patiently waiting for their final polish. You're still drifting, eyes perhaps half closed, as we consider one of the most fundamental yet often overlooked aspects of the Benin Bronzes, sourcing the precious metals. Imagine the challenge in an age before global supply chains as we know them, before reliable maps, before steamships. How did a landlocked kingdom like Benin acquire the vast quantities of copper and tin needed for its flourishing bronze industry? This wasn't a matter of popping down to the local metal emporium, it was a logistical feat of epic proportions. The primary metals, copper and tin, were not abundant locally within the immediate vicinity of Benin City. This meant they had to be acquired through extensive, complex trade networks that stretched across vast distances of West Africa and beyond. Copper, in particular, was often sourced from mines in the Sahara and even as far as North Africa, transported across the desert by camel caravans. Imagine the immense effort, raw ore, heavy and unwieldy, making a perilous journey across scorching sands and unforgiving terrain, often taking months or even years. This mainstream historical fact highlights the incredible reach of pre-colonial African trade. Tin, that elusive ingredient we spoke of earlier, was also sourced from various points, sometimes from central Nigeria, but potentially also from further afield, including parts of what is now modern-day Congo or even areas beyond the Sahara. The routes for tin were equally complex, often involving multiple intermediaries, each adding a layer of cost and time to the process. You can almost feel the dry desert air, the slow sway of the camels, the constant vigilance required to protect such valuable cargo. A quirky tidbit is that much of the copper that reached Benin was not necessarily in its raw ore form, but often came as manillas, horseshoe-shaped metal bracelets, or ingots that functioned as a form of currency or standardized trade good. These manillas were cast in Europe, specifically for the West African trade, using copper sourced from European mines. So, in a fascinating historical loop, European copper was traded for West African goods and then melted down by Benin artisans to create objects that often depicted European traders themselves. Historians still argue whether the reliance on imported copper and tin, particularly from European sources, fundamentally altered Benin's internal economy, or if it simply provided a more consistent supply for an already established local industry. It's a bit like wondering if getting new, fancier art supplies changes an artist's style, or just makes it easier to create what they already envisioned. Regardless, the acquisition of these metals was a testament to Benin's economic power and its ability to integrate into complex international trade systems, all to feed the insatiable demand for those magnificent, soon-to-be polished bronzes. You're still drifting gently through the quiet annals of history, and now we've arrived at the very heart of the creation process for those remarkable objects, the lost wax process unveiled. We touched upon it earlier with the Igbo UKWU, but let's settle in and truly visualize the meticulous, almost meditative steps involved in creating a large Benin bronze, like a commemorative head or a grand plaque. This wasn't a quick sprint, it was a patient, artistic marathon. First, imagine the armature. For larger pieces, the artisans would begin by building a rough core, usually from clay or charcoal, that roughly approximates the inner shape of the final object. This core would be slightly smaller than the desired final piece, leaving space for the wax layer. It's like building the basic skeleton of your sculpture. Then the real artistry begins. A layer of pure beeswax, often mixed with palm oil for malleability, is carefully applied over this core. This is where the magic happens. Every single detail, every nuanced expression on a face, every intricate pattern on a plaque is meticulously sculpted into this wax layer. You can almost feel the soft, pliable wax yielding under the sculptor's fingers, the tiny tools coaxing out astonishing levels of detail. This mainstream historical fact, the exquisite detail of the wax model, is paramount. Once the wax model is perfected, the next critical step is creating the mold. The wax model is coated with successive layers of fine, liquid clay, carefully brushed on to capture every minute detail, followed by coarser layers to build up strength and thickness. Imagine coating a delicate spider web with mud, but doing it with infinite precision. Small wax rods, acting as vents and pouring channels, are also attached to the model. These are crucial for allowing the wax to escape and the molten metal to enter. This stage requires immense patience and skill. A single air bubble or crack in the mold could ruin the entire casting. Then comes the dramatic moment, firing the mold. The clay-encased wax model is slowly heated in a furnace. As the temperature rises, the wax within melts and flows out through those carefully placed channels, leaving behind a perfectly hollow cavity, the lost wax. You can almost hear the soft hiss and drip as the wax makes its final exit. This hollow mold is then strengthened by further firing. Finally, the molten bronze, heated to incredibly high temperatures, is carefully poured into the now empty clay mold. The bronze fills every crevice, faithfully replicating the intricate details of the original wax model. Historians still argue whether the temperature control in these ancient furnaces was intuitive and based on generations of experience, or if they had more systematic ways of gauging heat. It's a bit like wondering if a master chef cooks by feel or by strict recipes. After the metal cools and solidifies, the arduous task of breaking away the clay mold begins. This is a moment of anticipation, a reveal. And what emerges is the rough casting, a piece that, while detailed, is far from its final, polished glory. This initial casting, a quirky tidbit often surprising to those unfamiliar with the process, is usually covered in rough patches, remnants of the mold, and casting sprues, the channels where the metal was poured. This is where the next, equally painstaking step comes in, the hours, days, and sometimes weeks of polishing. But that, my friend, is a story for our next gentle slide into history. You're still in that cozy, almost asleep state, aren't you? Good. We've just witnessed the grand reveal, the Benin bronze, freshly pulled from its broken mold. But hold on. It's not yet the gleaming masterpiece you might imagine. Far from it. What emerges from the clay is a rough, dull, and rather unassuming object, often covered in remnants of the mold and the telltale nubs where the molten metal was poured. This is where the truly mind-numbing, patience-testing, yet utterly crucial stage of polishing, more than shine, begins. You can almost feel the gritty texture of the unpolished bronze, a stark contrast to the smooth, reflective surface it would eventually achieve. See, polishing wasn't just about making the bronzes pretty for the Oba's palace. Oh no, it was deeply functional and integral to the casting process itself. The lost wax method, while incredibly sophisticated, inherently leaves imperfections. There might be tiny seams where mold sections met, stubborn bits of clay clinging to the surface, or minor irregularities in the metal itself. Polishing was the meticulous process of removing these casting flaws, smoothing out any rough edges, and evening out the surface. It was akin to refining a raw diamond. The inherent beauty is there, but it takes immense effort to bring out its true sparkle. Imagine a workshop, perhaps dimly lit by the flickering glow of an oil lamp, the air thick with the dust of abrasive materials. You see artisans, their faces intent, their hands moving with practiced precision, often hunched over the very objects we now admire behind museum glass. This mainstream historical fact, the extensive labor involved in post-casting finishing, is often overlooked when we marvel at the final product. We see the shine, not the sweat. Each stroke, each rub was not just about aesthetics. It was about ensuring the longevity and integrity of the piece. A smoother surface would resist corrosion better, and any remaining clay residue could potentially cause issues over time. A quirky tidbit is that the term bronze is often used broadly, but many of the Benin pieces are actually made of brass, an alloy of copper and zinc, which often has a slightly more yellowish hue. While the lost wax process is similar for both, their precise compositions could affect the polishing technique slightly. Historians still argue whether the choice between bronze and brass was purely pragmatic, based on metal availability, or if there were specific aesthetic or ritualistic preferences for one over the other in different periods. It's a bit like wondering if they chose a particular paint color because it was cheaper or because it conveyed a deeper meaning. Regardless of the exact alloy, the subsequent process of polishing was painstaking. This wasn't a job for the impatient. It was a commitment to perfection, one tiny abrasive grain at a time, preparing the object for its eventual, dazzling presentation. You're still there, aren't you? Good. Our gentle journey through the polishing process continues. Now that we understand why polishing was so crucial, let's explore how it was done, focusing on the very first stage, abrasives, nature's tools. Imagine stepping into an ancient Benin workshop, not just with the rhythmic clangs of casting, but also the fine, almost imperceptible scrape of material against metal. The artisans of Benin didn't have electric sanders or sophisticated chemical polishes. Their tools were drawn directly from the natural world, harnessed through centuries of accumulated knowledge. You can almost feel the fine dust tickling your nose, the subtle grit underfoot. The primary abrasive material used for the initial rough work was, quite simply, sand. Not just any sand, but likely fine-grained, consistent sand found in riverbeds or specific geological deposits. Imagine collecting buckets of this natural abrasive, carefully sifting it to remove impurities, ready for the demanding work ahead. This mainstream historical fact reminds us of the ingenuity of ancient technologies, making the most of readily available resources. The sand, often mixed with water or a binding agent, would be rubbed against the bronze surface, patiently grinding away the rough spots, sprues, and any lingering bits of clay from the casting process. This initial phase was about brute force, albeit applied with incredible care, to smooth the surface without damaging the intricate details. Beyond sand, other natural materials would have been employed. Think of coarse leaves or fibrous plants, perhaps even certain types of rough textured wood. These could be used as carriers for the sand or as mild abrasives themselves, providing a gentler yet still effective way to refine the surface. A quirky tidbit is the potential use of crushed animal bone or even powdered seashells, which contain calcium carbonate, a mild abrasive. While direct evidence for this particular usage on Benin bronzes might be scarce, similar materials were used in other ancient polishing contexts globally, showing a shared understanding of natural abrasives. Historians still argue whether specific types of wood or plant fibers, known for their abrasive qualities, were cultivated or specially sourced for this purpose, or if it was a more opportunistic use of whatever was readily available. It's a bit like wondering if they had a dedicated polishing garden or just grabbed whatever looked scratchy from the nearby bush. This first stage of polishing was undoubtedly the most physically demanding. It required strong hands, tireless repetition, and an eye for imperfection. You can picture the artisans, their muscles aching, perhaps humming a quiet tune to pass the time, as they painstakingly transformed a dull, rough casting into an object that was merely smooth, but not yet shining. This was the foundation, the groundwork upon which the final, breathtaking luster would be built. The goal here wasn't gloss, but preparation, patiently abrading away the imperfections of the casting, one tiny gritty particle at a time. You're still in that comfortable, almost asleep state, letting the details of history wash over you. We've gone through the rough and tumble of initial abrasion, where natural materials like sand did the heavy lifting. Now imagine the bronze object, smooth to the touch, free of major imperfections, but still lacking that characteristic gleam. This is where the truly painstaking, almost meditative work of fine finishing, hours and days, comes into play. This stage wasn't about removing large flaws. It was about coaxing out the metal's inherent luminosity, patiently building up a mirror-like shine. You can almost feel the gentle friction, the subtle warmth emanating from the surface as it slowly begins to reflect the light. The materials used for fine finishing would have been far more subtle than coarse sand. Think of very fine, almost silken cloths made from natural fibers, perhaps rubbed with even finer abrasive powders. Materials like ash from specific types of wood, or perhaps fine, almost microscopic particles of quartz or even volcanic ash could have been employed. These wouldn't scratch the surface. Rather, they would gently burnish it, compacting the metal molecules at the surface and creating that beautiful, light, reflecting sheen. This mainstream historical fact highlights the sophisticated understanding of material properties possessed by ancient artisans. It's a bit like polishing a dull stone until it reveals its inner sparkle, but on a grander, more arduous scale. Imagine the artisan now leaning in closer, their movements slower, more deliberate. Each stroke would be precise, methodical, covering every inch of the intricate surface. For detailed areas, perhaps tiny sticks wrapped in soft cloth, or even the pads of fingers would be used. The process was iterative. Apply a polishing agent, rub, wipe clean, examine, and then repeat, perhaps switching to an even finer abrasive. This wasn't a quick job. It literally took hours, days, and for larger, more complex pieces, potentially weeks of continuous dedicated effort by multiple individuals. You can almost feel the repetitive motion, the zen-like focus required to achieve such perfection. It's a test of endurance as much as it is a display of skill. A quirky tidbit that adds to the allure of these objects is the possibility that natural oils or plant extracts were also used in the final stages of polishing. These would not only enhance the shine but also provide a protective layer, helping to prevent tarnishing. Historians still argue whether certain secret recipes for polishing compounds were passed down through the guilds, or if the efficacy came more from the sheer elbow grease and technique applied. It's like wondering if a secret sauce makes a dish delicious, or if it's simply the chef's masterful touch. Regardless, the culmination of this immense effort was the transformation of a dull metal casting into a vibrant, reflective work of art, a testament to the Oba's power and the unparalleled skill of the Igunaramwan. This was the ultimate finish. A slow, painstaking journey from raw metal to gleaming glory, a process that makes you appreciate every millimeter of their enduring shine. You're still in that comfortable, almost asleep state, letting the gentle current of history carry you forward. We've marveled at the sheer physical effort and technical genius that went into casting and polishing the Benin Bronzes. But how was this incredibly complex knowledge maintained and transmitted across centuries? The answer lies in the deeply ingrained system of oral histories and craft knowledge. Imagine a time before written manuals, before YouTube tutorials. Knowledge was a living, breathing thing, embodied in the skilled hands and minds of the artisans themselves. In Benin, As in many traditional societies, the transmission of knowledge was primarily experiential and generational. Apprenticeships weren't just a casual learning period. They were a rigorous, immersive process. Young boys, often from families already within the Iganoramwan Guild, would begin their training at a very early age. They would start with the simplest tasks, perhaps preparing clay or melting wax, slowly progressing to more complex steps as their understanding and dexterity grew. You can almost hear the patient instructions from an elder master, the quiet corrections, the unspoken communication that comes from years of shared work. This mainstream historical fact of oral transmission is vital to understanding the continuity of such sophisticated crafts. Every stage of the lost wax process, from preparing the core to applying the final polish, was taught through direct observation, demonstration, and hands-on practice. The recipes for clay molds, the precise mixture of beeswax and palm oil, the subtle indicators of correct metal temperature, the techniques for achieving that ultimate shine, all were learned not from books, but from watching, doing, and repeating. It was a sensory education. The smell of the melting wax, the feel of the clay, the sound of the metal pouring, the subtle visual cues of a perfectly polished surface. A quirky tidbit that underscores the depth of this oral tradition is that some of the specific chants or rituals performed during the casting process, believed to ensure a successful outcome, were also passed down orally. These weren't just superstitions. They reinforced the discipline and focus required for such a demanding craft. Historians still argue whether the extreme secrecy surrounding some of these guild practices was primarily to maintain their exclusive status and power, or if it was genuinely believed that revealing the knowledge would diminish its spiritual efficacy. It's a bit like wondering if a secret family recipe is guarded for competitive advantage or because it's truly sacred. Regardless, this deeply embedded system of oral transmission ensured that the intricate secrets of bronze casting and polishing were preserved and perfected, allowing the tradition of the Benin Bronzes to flourish with astonishing consistency for centuries, a true testament to the power of human connection and inherited wisdom. You're still floating in that serene space as we delve deeper into the meaning behind the gleaming surfaces of the Benin Bronzes. These weren't just impressive sculptures, they were profoundly imbued with ritual significance. Imagine the Oba's palace, not just as a seat of political power, but as a vibrant spiritual hub, where every object, especially the bronzes, played a vital role in maintaining the cosmic and social order. You can almost feel the weight of tradition, the silent reverence these objects commanded. The bronzes served as powerful visual narratives and symbolic anchors for the Benin Kingdom's spiritual beliefs. The commemorative heads, for instance, were central to ancestral veneration. After an Oba's death, a bronze head would be commissioned to honor him, serving as a focal point for rituals and prayers. These rituals were believed to ensure the continuity of the royal line and the prosperity of the kingdom. It's a mainstream historical fact that ancestral veneration was, and remains, a cornerstone of many African spiritual systems, and the Benin bronzes were magnificent expressions of this belief. You can almost see the flickering light of a ceremonial flame dancing across the burnished features of an Oba's head, casting long, solemn shadows. Beyond ancestral rites, the plaques, carved with depictions of historical events, court life, and mythological figures, also held ritualistic importance. They didn't just record history, they reinforced the divine right of the Oba, celebrated military victories, and depicted the sacred rituals that bound the kingdom together. Each scene, each symbol, was a layer of meaning, understood by the initiated and conveying the power and order of the universe as perceived by the Edo people. It's a bit like a medieval tapestry that not only tells a story but is also blessed to protect the castle. A quirky tidbit often missed is the belief that the material itself, bronze, possessed spiritual properties. Its durability, its ability to withstand the elements, and its rich, enduring luster were seen as reflections of the Oba's eternal power and the enduring strength of the kingdom. This wasn't merely a practical material. It was seen as a divine substance. Historians still argue whether the elaborate symbolism embedded in the bronzes was primarily for the spiritual edification of the Benin people, or if it also served as a sophisticated form of political communication to visitors and rivals. It's like wondering if a national flag is just a symbol of identity or also a statement of power. Regardless, the hours of polishing, the painstaking craftsmanship, imbued these objects with a tangible sense of sacredness, making them far more than mere works of art. They were the very embodiment of Benin's soul. You're still floating serenely, and as the narrative unfurls, we arrive at a pivotal yet initially subtle shift in our story. European arrival and early trade. Imagine the late 15th century. The powerful Benin kingdom, having flourished for centuries, now encounters a new, curious presence on its coast. European ships, first Portuguese, then Dutch, and later British. You can almost hear the unfamiliar creak of wooden hulls, the flap of foreign sails, and the murmur of strange tongues carried on the sea breeze. Initially, these encounters were characterized by trade and mutual curiosity. The Europeans were primarily interested in West Africa's valuable resources: gold, ivory, pepper, and later, unfortunately, enslaved people. For Benin, the Europeans offered new goods, textiles, beads, and most crucially for our story, copper and brass. Remember how Benin needed to source its metals? The arrival of European traders, willing to exchange large quantities of these metals for local commodities, was a significant development. This mainstream historical fact often sets the stage for what would later become a much more fraught relationship. You can picture the bustling coastal markets, a fascinating blend of cultures where goods and ideas were exchanged, and where the first brass manillas began to flow inland, ready to be melted down. The relationship was, for a time, largely on Benin's terms. The Oba maintained strict control over trade, ensuring that it served the kingdom's interests. European traders were often restricted to coastal areas and permitted to enter Benin City only with specific permission. This control allowed Benin to leverage its resources and power effectively, gaining access to desired European goods, including the very metals that fueled its artistic production. A quirky tidbit is that some of the earliest Benin plaques actually depict these European visitors, often with remarkable detail: their ships, their clothing, and their distinctive features. These depictions serve as fascinating historical records, showing how the Benin artists integrated new visual elements into their existing stylistic traditions. Historians still argue whether the increased availability of European brass and copper led to an upsurge in the production of the Benin Bronzes, making them more common than they would have been otherwise, or if it simply made the acquisition of raw materials easier for an already prolific industry. It's a bit like wondering if getting a bigger art budget encourages more art, or just more elaborate art. However, this early period was marked by a fragile balance, a period of relative respect and symbiotic exchange. But as the centuries wore on and European imperial ambitions grew, this balance would inevitably and tragically shift. The gentle sounds of trade would eventually be replaced by the harsh realities of colonial expansion. You're still in that comfortable, almost asleep state, letting the currents of history carry you. We've witnessed the initial, relatively balanced trade between Benin and European powers. But as we drift into the 19th century, the atmosphere thickens, and the relationship between the powerful African kingdom and the ambitious European nations begins to curdle. This is the period of escalating tensions and imperial greed. Imagine the growing whispers of European expansion, the increasing demands for trade concessions, and the ominous shadow of colonial ambition stretching across the continent. The balance of power began to tip dramatically. European industrialization created an insatiable demand for raw materials and new markets, viewing Africa not as a collection of independent kingdoms, but as a vast untapped resource. The British, in particular, with their burgeoning empire, became increasingly dominant. Their interests shifted from equitable trade to exerting control. They sought to dismantle the Oba's strict trade monopolies and gain direct access to the interior. You can almost feel the simmering resentment, the clash of two vastly different worldviews. Benin's desire to maintain its sovereignty and traditions, and Britain's relentless drive for economic and political dominance. This period was marked by increasing diplomatic friction, misunderstandings, and outright provocation. There were disputes over trade routes, clashes over judicial authority, and a growing sense of British impatience with Benin's perceived obstinacy. The Oba, guardian of his kingdom's sovereignty, resisted these encroachments, leading to a dangerous standoff. This mainstream historical fact, the shift from trade to colonial imposition, is a tragic, recurring theme in the history of European expansion in Africa. A quirky tidbit that highlights the cultural clash is the British fascination with and simultaneous misunderstanding of Benin's powerful spiritual practices. Some European accounts describe the kingdom's rituals, including human sacrifice, which, while present, was likely exaggerated by British narratives to justify intervention, as barbaric, conveniently overlooking their own practices and using these cultural differences as a pretext for intervention. Historians still argue whether the British punitive expedition was primarily a response to a specific incident of violence against their delegates, or if it was a premeditated act of imperial aggression, merely seeking a convenient excuse to annex the wealthy kingdom and seize its treasures. It's a bit like wondering if a bully truly feels provoked, or just needed a reason to take your lunch money. Regardless of the exact trigger, the stage was set for a devastating confrontation, an event that would forever alter the fate of the Benin Bronzes and the proud kingdom that created them. The gentle hum of diplomacy was replaced by the ominous drumbeat of conflict. You're still drifting, gently, through the somber corridors of history. The simmering tensions we just explored would, unfortunately, erupt into a devastating blaze. The punitive expedition of 1897. Imagine the foreboding atmosphere in January of that year. A small British delegation, attempting to force their way into Benin City against the Oba's explicit warnings during a sacred festival, was attacked and most of its members killed. This incident provided the long-sought pretext for a full-scale military intervention. You can almost feel the shockwaves of that event, the sudden, terrible escalation from strained diplomacy to outright war. The British response was swift and brutal. In February 1897, a massive military expedition comprising over 1,200 British Marines, sailors, and colonial troops was launched against Benin City. Their mission was explicitly punitive to avenge the deaths of the delegation and, implicitly, to dismantle the Oba's independent kingdom and seize its valuable resources. This mainstream historical fact marks a dark chapter in the history of colonial conquest. You can almost hear the rhythmic tramp of soldiers, the distant crackle of rifle fire, the sounds of an ancient city under siege. The well-fortified city of Benin put up a fierce, albeit ultimately futile, resistance. The Oba's warriors fought bravely, but they were outmatched by the superior firepower and organization of the British forces, armed with Maxim guns and modern artillery. The fighting was intense, and the city ultimately fell after heavy bombardment. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic. Benin City was sacked, burned, and looted. Thousands of its inhabitants were killed, and the Oba, Ramwin was eventually exiled. It was a complete and utter dismantling of a sovereign power. And then, the Bronzes. During the systematic looting of the palace and other royal compounds, British troops discovered the vast collections of Benin bronzes, ivories, and other precious artifacts. These objects, which had served as the spiritual and historical anchors of the kingdom for centuries, were stripped from their sacred context. They were seen not as priceless works of art or historical records, but as booty or curios ripe for the taking. A quirky tidbit that underscores the brazenness of this act is that many British soldiers openly posed for photographs with the looted bronzes, their faces reflecting a mix of triumph and casual disregard for the cultural significance of their plunder. Historians still argue whether the scale of the looting was an unplanned consequence of the expedition's success, or if the acquisition of Benin's treasures was a significant, albeit unspoken, objective from the very beginning, driven by reports of the kingdom's immense wealth. It's a bit like wondering if a thief stumbles upon a treasure chest, or if they were looking for it all along. The ultimate result, however, was the scattering of these magnificent artifacts across the globe, severing them from their homeland and marking the beginning of a long, arduous journey towards their uncertain future.